France, at the end of the 18th century, was a nation glittering on the surface and rotting underneath. Versailles shone with gold, mirrors, silk, and endless ceremony, while beyond its gates, hunger spread like a slow-burning fire. The French Revolution did not erupt overnight. It was born in silence, in empty stomachs, unpaid debts, and a people who had reached the breaking point. For centuries, France had lived under an absolute monarchy. The king ruled by divine right, answerable only to God. Louis XVI inherited this throne in 1774, a man unprepared for the storm ahead. He was not cruel by nature, but indecisive, distant, and trapped within a system already collapsing under its own weight. French society was divided into three rigid estates. The first estate, the clergy, owned vast lands and paid almost no taxes. The second estate, the nobility, enjoyed privileges, titles, and wealth. The third estate, over 97% of the population, carried the entire burden of taxation. Peasants, workers, merchants, and professionals labored endlessly while struggling to survive. By the 1780s, France was drowning in debt. Costly wars, including support for the American Revolution, had emptied the royal treasury. Lavish spending at court continued, untouched by the suffering beyond Versailles. Attempts to reform the tax system failed again and again, blocked by nobles unwilling to sacrifice their privileges. Meanwhile, food prices soared. Poor harvests led to bread shortages, and bread was life itself for the French people. When bread disappeared, desperation took its place. Riots broke out across the countryside. Bakers were attacked, grain convoys looted, and rumors spread faster than facts. At court, Queen Marie Antoinette became the symbol of excess. Whether deserved or exaggerated, she represented everything the people despised: luxury, indifference, and foreign influence. Pamphlets mocked her relentlessly, painting her as an enemy of the nation. By 1788, France stood at the edge of bankruptcy. With no alternatives left, Louis XVI made a fateful decision. He summoned the Estates General, an assembly that had not met since 1614. The kingdom was desperate. The people believed change was finally possible. When representatives gathered at Versailles in May 1789, tension filled the halls. Each estate had one vote, ensuring the clergy and nobility could always outvote the Third Estate. But this time, the Third Estate refused to accept the old rules. They demanded voting by head count, not by estate. When ignored, they took a revolutionary step. On June 17, 1789, they declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the will of the French people. Days later, locked out of their meeting hall, they gathered in a nearby tennis court. There, they swore an oath that would echo through history: they would not disband until France had a constitution. This was the tennis court oath, a direct challenge to royal authority. Louis XVI hesitated. Troops were moved toward Paris. Fear spread that the king would crush the assembly by force. In the streets, panic turned into rage. On July 14, 1789, the people of Paris acted. They marched on the Bastille, a medieval fortress prison and symbol of royal tyranny. Though it held only a handful of prisoners, its fall carried immense symbolic power. The Bastille was stormed after hours of fighting. The governor was killed. His head was paraded through the streets on a pike. The message was unmistakable: the old order was no longer untouchable. Across France, news spread like wildfire. Peasants rose against their lords. Castles burned. Feudal records were destroyed. This wave of unrest became known as the Great Fear. Terrified and overwhelmed, the National Assembly abolished feudal privileges in August 1789. Noble titles, ancient rights, and centuries-old structures collapsed in a single night. Soon after, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was proclaimed, asserting liberty, equality, and sovereignty of the people. But revolution is never satisfied with its first victory. The fall of the Bastille was not the end. It was only the beginning. France had broken its chains, but blood would soon follow. By 1791, the French Revolution had already devoured its illusions. What began as a movement for reform had become a storm no one could control. The king still sat on the throne, but power was slipping through his fingers like sand. The people no longer whispered their anger. They shouted it in the streets. Louis XVI was trapped between two worlds. To the revolutionaries, he was a traitor waiting for the right moment to strike back. To Europe's monarchs, he was a prisoner whose weakness endangered every crown on the continent. The king hesitated, delayed, and hoped the storm would pass. It never did. In June 1791, the illusion of loyalty collapsed completely. Under cover of darkness, Louis XVI and his family attempted to flee Paris. Disguised, escorted, desperate, they aimed for the eastern border, where loyal troops awaited. But the king was recognized in the town of Varennes. Arrested. Returned to Paris in silence. The people watched as their king came back not as a ruler, but as a captive. Trust was dead. From that moment on, the monarchy survived only on borrowed time. The revolution had crossed a psychological line. A king who tries to escape his people can never rule them again. Paris grew more radical by the week. Political clubs multiplied, each more extreme than the last. The Jacobins preached vigilance and purity. The Cordeliers demanded action and punishment. Newspapers flooded the streets with accusations, rumors, and calls for justice. Words became weapons. Meanwhile, France was surrounded by enemies. Austria and Prussia threatened intervention, claiming to defend the royal family. Louis XVI was arrested and imprisoned with his family in the Temple. The National Convention abolished the monarchy and proclaimed the French Republic. France no longer had a king. It had a revolution without limits. But victory brought no peace. Inside Paris, fear reached a fever pitch. As foreign armies advanced, rumors spread that prisoners would rise up and massacre patriots from within. In September 1792, mobs stormed the prisons. For days, Paris drowned in blood. Men, women, priests, nobles, guilty or innocent, were dragged before improvised tribunals and executed on the spot. The September massacres shocked even hardened revolutionaries. Justice had been replaced by terror disguised as necessity. And still, the revolution pushed forward. In December 1792, Louis XVI was put on trial. Not as a king, but as a citizen. Louis Capet. Accused of treason against the nation. The trial was not about evidence. It was about symbolism. Could a revolution truly be free while its former king lived? The vote was close. Agonizingly close. But history would not hesitate. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was led to the guillotine. He tried to speak. The drums drowned his voice. The blade fell. The crowd cheered. The king was dead. And with him died any hope of moderation. Europe recoiled in horror. Monarchies declared war on revolutionary France. Inside the country, rebellion erupted. The Vendée rose in open revolt. Federalist cities resisted Paris. France was surrounded by enemies, both foreign and domestic. The revolution answered with a single word: terror. Power concentrated in the Committee of Public Safety. Emergency measures became permanent. Surveillance intensified. Accusations multiplied. To question the revolution was to betray it. The guillotine no longer waited for kings. It waited for everyone. And at the center of this storm, new figures emerged, men who believed fear was not a failure of the revolution, but its most powerful weapon. Men who believed that liberty could only survive if enemies were destroyed before they could speak. The blade had tasted royal blood. Soon, it would demand much more. By 1793, the French Revolution had crossed a point of no return. What began as a movement for liberty and constitutional reform had transformed into a ruthless struggle for survival, power, and ideological purity. France was now surrounded by enemies. Monarchies across Europe watched in horror as a king was executed by his own people, and they prepared to crush the revolution before it spread further. At home, rebellion erupted in the countryside, particularly in the Vendée, where peasants rose against the revolutionary government in the name of faith and tradition. The new republic was at war on all fronts, and fear became the dominant emotion of the age. Fear of invasion. Fear of betrayal. Fear that the revolution would collapse from within. In this climate of paranoia, moderation was no longer tolerated. To hesitate was to invite suspicion. To question was to risk death. Power increasingly concentrated in the hands of the Committee of Public Safety, a small group of men tasked with defending the revolution at any cost. Among them emerged Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer from Arras who had once spoken passionately about virtue, equality, and the rights of man. Now, he believed that the Republic could only survive through absolute moral purity enforced by terror. Robespierre argued that terror was not a betrayal of revolutionary ideals, but their logical conclusion. In his words, terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. To him, mercy toward enemies of the revolution was treason against the people. The Republic, he believed, must be cleansed of corruption, aristocracy, and counter-revolutionary thought. The Revolutionary Tribunal became the instrument of this cleansing. Trials were swift and often predetermined. Evidence was thin, witnesses unreliable, and verdicts almost always fatal. The accused had little chance to defend themselves. Guilt was often assumed based on association, rumor, or mere suspicion. To be denounced was usually enough to be condemned. The guillotine worked relentlessly. In Paris, executions became a daily spectacle. Crowds gathered in public squares to watch heads fall into baskets. What had once shocked the population became routine. The blade rose and fell with mechanical efficiency, transforming death into a process, an administrative act of the state. Victims came from every class of society. Former nobles, priests, political rivals, journalists, peasants, and even revolutionary heroes themselves were sent to the scaffold. Georges Danton, one of the revolution's most charismatic leaders, dared to call for an end to the violence. He argued that the revolution was devouring its own children. For this, he was arrested, tried, and executed. As he mounted the scaffold, he warned that the terror would not stop with him. Outside Paris, the repression was even more brutal. In Lyon, after a counter-revolutionary uprising, entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Executions were carried out by mass shootings and artillery fire when the guillotine proved too slow. In Nantes, thousands were drowned in the Loire River in what became known as the Republican baptisms. Men, women, and children were bound together and thrown into the water to die. Religion was declared an enemy of the Republic. Churches were closed or repurposed. Priests were forced to renounce their vows or face execution. A new revolutionary calendar replaced the Christian one, erasing Sundays and religious holidays. Notre Dame Cathedral was transformed into a temple of reason, symbolizing the attempt to replace faith with revolutionary ideology. Fear seeped into every home. Neighbors watched neighbors. Families avoided speaking openly, unsure who might be listening. A careless word, a misunderstood joke, or an old letter could lead to denunciation. Silence became a survival strategy. Ironically, the terror achieved its immediate goals. The revolutionary armies pushed back foreign invaders. Internal revolts were crushed. The Republic survived. But the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands were executed, and many more died in prisons, wars, and mass killings. The revolution that promised liberty now ruled through fear. As the violence escalated, even those within the revolutionary government began to feel threatened. If Danton could be executed, who was safe? The logic of terror allowed no limits. Each execution justified the next. The revolution demanded constant proof of loyalty, and no one could ever be loyal enough. By mid-1794, Robespierre stood at the height of his power, yet also at the edge of his downfall. Surrounded by enemies, real and imagined, he became increasingly isolated. His speeches grew darker, filled with warnings of conspiracies and traitors lurking everywhere. Many in the convention began to fear that they would be next. The guillotine, once hailed as a tool of justice, now loomed over the revolution itself. The question was no longer whether terror would end, but who it would claim next. The French Revolution had unleashed forces it could no longer control, and the blade that fell on the enemies of the Republic was slowly turning inward. By the summer of 1794, the French Revolution had reached a point of no return. What began as a cry for liberty had transformed into a machinery of fear. The guillotine, once praised as a symbol of equality, now dominated the streets of Paris like a permanent shadow. Crowds no longer gathered out of excitement or justice, but out of habit, numbness, and terror. The revolution was no longer fighting enemies, it was consuming itself. Maximilien Robespierre stood at the center of this storm. To his supporters, he was the incorruptible guardian of the Republic, the only man pure enough to defend virtue against corruption. To his enemies, he was a tyrant in revolutionary clothing, ruling through paranoia and blood. Robespierre believed that terror was not a betrayal of the revolution, but its necessary weapon. In his mind, virtue without terror was powerless, and terror without virtue was murderous. Together, he claimed, they would cleanse France. But terror had no brakes. The law of 22 Prairial marked the final descent into madness. Trials became swift and meaningless. Defendants were denied lawyers. Evidence was optional. The only possible verdicts were acquittal or death. The revolutionary tribunal became a conveyor belt feeding the guillotine. Executions multiplied. Nobles, priests, former revolutionaries, ordinary citizens, anyone could be next. A careless word, an old friendship, a suspicious silence could seal a fate. Fear spread even among those who once held power. Members of the Committee of Public Safety slept uneasily, knowing that yesterday's executioner could become tomorrow's victim. The revolution had erased trust. Survival depended not on loyalty, but on being less visible than the next target. Robespierre, increasingly isolated, withdrew from public life. He spoke less, but when he did, his words were ominous. He hinted at traitors within the government, enemies hiding in plain sight. He did not name them. That uncertainty terrified everyone. Deputies in the National Convention listened in silence, wondering if they were already condemned. On July 26, 1794, Robespierre delivered his final speech. He spoke of conspiracies, of moral decay, of the need for purification. But once again, he refused to name names. That hesitation proved fatal. By leaving his enemies guessing, he united them. Fear overcame ideology. Survival overcame loyalty. The next morning, Robespierre was interrupted mid-speech. Shouts filled the chamber. Accusations flew. The man who had sent thousands to their deaths found himself powerless. The convention turned against him. He was arrested alongside his closest allies, including Saint-Just and Couthon. Paris held its breath. That night, Robespierre was freed by supporters and taken to the Hôtel de Ville. For a moment, it seemed possible that the revolution would devour itself one final time in civil war. But the momentum was gone. The crowds did not rise. The sections of Paris remained silent. The spell was broken. When government troops stormed the building, Robespierre attempted suicide. The shot shattered his jaw but did not kill him. Bloodied and silent, unable to speak, he was arrested once more. The irony was absolute. The architect of terror would receive the same justice he had imposed on so many others. On July 28, 1794, Robespierre was executed by guillotine. His jaw bound with blood-soaked cloth, he stared into the same blade he had defended as a moral instrument. The crowd did not cheer. They watched in exhausted silence. The terror ended not with triumph, but with relief. What followed was not peace, but reaction. The Thermidorian reaction dismantled the machinery of terror. Prison doors opened. Survivors emerged pale and broken. The guillotine slowed, then stopped. France attempted to breathe again. But the scars were deep. The revolution had succeeded in destroying the old order, but it had failed to build stability. Power shifted once more, this time to the Directory, weak, corrupt, and disconnected from the people. Economic hardship returned. Political violence simmered beneath the surface. The dream of a virtuous republic faded into disillusionment. Yet the revolution could not be undone. It had shattered the idea that kings ruled by divine right. It had declared that sovereignty belonged to the people, even if that idea had been drowned in blood. Across Europe, rulers watched with fear. Across the world, revolutionaries watched with inspiration. Out of the chaos, a new figure began to rise. A general shaped by war, ambition, and the ruins of revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte would soon seize power, promising order where there had been terror, glory where there had been suffering. The revolution would end not with democracy, but with empire. And still, its legacy endured. Liberty, equality, fraternity, words stained by blood, but impossible to erase. The French Revolution proved that humanity could challenge absolute power, but it also revealed how quickly justice could become vengeance, and ideals could become weapons. When the guillotine ruled, France learned a brutal truth: a revolution can overthrow a tyrant, but if unchecked, it can become one. The blade falls. The crowd disperses. History remembers.